So I was wondering if either of you could just give us a brief description or a brief, delineation of the difference between voluntary euthanasia, assisted suicide, and run-of-the-mill suicide.
Well, as I see it, all of the phenomena that we're talking about here can be classified as suicide. In saying that, I am ruffling the feathers of a lot of activist groups that advocate for the legalization of assisted dying. Those groups generally tend to avoid the word suicide in discussing euthanasia and assisted dying. And they do so because the word suicide has a lot of negative connotations in people's minds. And so they're trying to dissociate their cause from a term that might lead people to be more skeptical of what they're advocating for. But I think if we understand suicide, as most philosophers and most legal theorists do, as intentional self-killing, then all of the phenomena that we're talking about here are suicide. So run-of-the-mill suicide, I take it, is intentional self-killing that is done essentially through your own resources. That is to say, you're not receiving help from anyone in ending your life. The traditional term euthanasia, of course, literally means sort of good death or good killing,
Right.
and was customarily used for many centuries to mean sort of any act of ending another person's life for their own benefit. Now, the way the terminology has developed, I think people now use euthanasia to refer to the act of causing another person's death for their own benefit or perceived benefit. And within that category, then, we have a kind of tripartite division. We can speak of involuntary euthanasia, that is to say, where a person is killed for their own benefit, but contrary to their consent, that is, they do not wish to die. Voluntary euthanasia, where the person is killed with their consent or in accordance with their wishes. And then non-voluntary euthanasia, which involves situations where the person's consent is not elicited or it can't be elicited. So, for example, a person who's in a long-term coma can't consent for or against, right, their being euthanized. The term assisted suicide or assisted dying or assistance in dying has, on the other hand, taken to mean something like an act wherein a person assists you to die, but is not the sort of immediate cause, or their acts are not the immediate cause of your death. So assisted dying might encompass something like my giving a person information about how they might end their lives, or if I'm a doctor, writing a prescription for a drug that will enable them to end their lives, or giving them access to a technology, aware that the person will use it to end their lives. So there's a lot of terms that are in the air here. Again, I think all of them are in some sense, right, variations on a theme. They're all ways in which people, when they do so voluntarily at least, are aiming to hasten their own deaths, and hence they count as suicide. But much of the debate, I suppose, in the legal and policy realms has been about either assisted dying or voluntary euthanasia.
Mm. And I understand for euthanasia, you have an active and a passive form of euthanasia. Is that correct? Where the active is somebody is taking an active step to end your life, whereas passive euthanasia, you remove something that is keeping you alive.
Yes, though I think that those terms are a bit contentious in a certain sense. And I think that the way you describe them sort of illustrates how they are contentious. So passive euthanasia has come to designate something like a measure wherein a person acts so as an underlying medical condition that is leading to or is going to cause a person's death becomes operative. So, for example, if a individual is being sustained by an artificial ventilator, right, they provided artificial respiration, and they or their medical decision maker requests that ventilation be removed, and there's good reason to think that they will die relatively imminently, right, if that ventilation were to be removed, that would count as passive euthanasia. Likewise, the withdrawal of nutrition and hydration, right? Artificial nutrition and hydration can be viewed as an instance of passive euthanasia. But notice that in many cases, a person has to do something, right? So there's a way in which calling it passive euthanasia is perhaps slightly misleading,
Right.
because someone has to do something, right, to make it the case that your death will happen earlier than it otherwise would be. So you'll note that I tried to underscore there that when we talk about passive euthanasia, what we're really talking about is that the individual, right, who is intervening in the situation does not cause your death by introducing a new causal factor. So, for example, they don't, inject you with a lethal medication. Rather, they remove, right, some sort of feature of your care that is sustaining your life, and by removing that,
Right.
your death will presumably be hastened.
Well, so one question I had about this is because the distinction I agree is a little bit tricky, and in, let's say, in a case when somebody is suffering from a terminally ill disease, or even they're being kept alive by a defibrillator, and some machine is keeping them alive just barely. Why would there be a difference between injecting them with the lethal dose of morphine and removing the machine that is keeping them alive? Because wouldn't the injecting them with the lethal dose of morphine constitute active, but the removing the machine that's keeping them alive is considered passive? But in reality, they're both choices that are ending their lives.
Well, and if they're done voluntarily, right, that is to say that the patient provides voluntary consent to those measures, then you might think, indeed some philosophers have thought, James Rachel's being, I guess, the most famous example, that there really isn't a difference, a moral difference, right, between these two things. Now, clearly there's some, I guess we could say, metaphysical difference, right? If you were to ask in the case of typical instances of what we've been calling passive euthanasia, and again, I find that term somewhat misleading because, again, it usually requires someone to do something, to act. But in the cases of passive euthanasia that we've been discussing, it'd be natural to say that what causes the person's death is the underlying cancer, organ failure, whatever that brought them into that state in the first place. Whereas, right, injecting someone with a powerful, a lethal sedative, you might say that the cause of death has shifted from the underlying medical condition to this new factor, right, that's on the scene, right, the injection of a lethal drug. I think the significance of this is, the moral significance of this has to do with the traditional precept of medical ethics that doctors in particular are not to kill their patients or contribute to the killing of their patients. And many people throughout time have argued that doctors may permissibly participate in what we've been calling passive euthanasia because they don't kill their patients thereby. Right. Whereas they may not participate in active euthanasia because in that instance it would be the doctor killing or contributing to the killing. But I agree that the active passive language, I think, sometimes introduces more confusion than clarity here.
Right.
Yeah, so couldn't you say in the cases of passive euthanasia, you were suggesting that you'd say the cause of the death would be the cancer, the underlying disease. But couldn't you just as easily say that the cause of the death is the doctors removing the treatment for the cancer ultimately?
Well, I think it's tricky. And that's one of the classic criticisms, a criticism that I'm sympathetic to, by the way, that the active-passive contrast doesn't hold a lot of water. I think one way to see this is, to ask yourself, well, if we're talking about the difference between roughly killing and letting die, that's sort of how people sometimes couch it. It seems strange to think that if a doctor were to remove a ventilator that's keeping a person alive, and in so doing, they knowingly hasten the patient's death, right? It'd be strange to say that they're not killing the patient. Whereas I think we would all agree that if I broke into a hospital and found my enemy in the ICU and I removed his ventilator, I would say that I killed my enemy. Right? So it seems a little bit odd to think that who you are, right, could have any bearing on whether or not your death is the consequence of my killing you or my letting you die, consequence of an action or the consequence of something passive on my part. That's a very familiar problem or criticism with that basic distinction, even as a matter of, if you will, kind of metaphysics.
I guess.
Yeah, I've actually heard of this distinction before. The times I've heard it more is more in the context of utilitarianism and deontology, where from correct me again if I'm wrong in any of these sections, but utilitarians are more predisposed to not allowing a distinction between killing and letting die, whereas it's a bit more important to keep that for deontologists. Obviously, you're a Kantian ethicist yourself, so I would like to see your opinion on this.
I have some Kantian sympathies. I'm not an orthodox Kantian, but
Okay.
it is certainly true that utilitarians, because they're consequentialists, are not likely to put much stock in the distinction between killing and letting die, active, passive euthanasia. Consequentialist thinks that, whether we're acting rightfully or not depends upon the consequences of what we do. And, if the consequence of what someone does to bring about a person's death is essentially the same, whether active, passive, whether killing or letting die, well, the utilitarian is going to say that's, a distinction we perhaps can make, but it's not a distinction that bears any moral weight. You're right to say that many deontologists are likely to be more sympathetic to this line of thought, insofar as if you are a deontologist, kind of rule-based ethicist, you might think that there's a very important moral rule here at stake. Again, something like, we ought not kill, or doctors ought not kill their patients. And so some of the actions we've been describing would violate that rule, whereas one might think, right, that passive euthanasia doesn't amount, right, to killing someone. It amounts to permitting their deaths.
Yeah, I guess one question I had is, because I do think just intuitively there is a moral difference between, let's say, euthanizing somebody that is, I don't know, 100 years old, is sitting on their deathbed, and is or a deer that's not a deer, but a person that's been shot and wounded, and if they don't provide the necessary treatment, they're going to die in a minute. If they give treatment, maybe they'll die in a week. I do see that there's a difference between that where somebody is very close to death, or they are trending towards death in a very immediate sense, versus somebody who's a 25-year-old, 35-year-old adult in perfect health, and is voluntarily asking for their death. But I still think that intuitively most people would agree there is a difference between euthanizing somebody that is on the doorstep of death and somebody who has a long ways away. And I guess maybe that's part of what the passive and active distinction was trying to do. But is there a better way to account for that distinction, or maybe that distinction is not relevant morally?
Well, I mean, I think that, again, many theologians, medical ethicists, some philosophers have put a lot of weight on this difference between killing and letting die. Right? They not only think it's a viable distinction, as a matter of fact, they think it's a morally important distinction. Right? And indeed, I would say that the prevailing legal frameworks in many parts of the world, not all, but many parts of the world, are such that if a patient asks a doctor to remove, right, some technology, say that's sustaining their life, the doctor is obligated to do that, right? That the patient's rights as a patient, say that they're not to be subject to medical interventions that they don't wish to receive. But at the same time, right, in many of those same jurisdictions, they're not entitled to seek assistance from their doctor, or maybe from anyone, right, to hasten their death via active means. Now, the question of sort of who, right, should have access to assisted dying, if anyone should, is, I suppose, one of the key legal and policy questions about assisted dying that people have been discussing in recent decades. The example that you gave of someone, a very aged person, very near death, versus someone, I suppose we could say, in the prime of their lives, who's requesting euthanasia. I think that the relevance there philosophically has to do with the degree of risk or the degree of harm at stake. So, if someone really is quite close to, if you will, a natural death, right, and has lived 80, 90, 100 years, you might think that if we assist them to die, they're not likely to lose out on much, right? They're likely to die within weeks, months, etc. The quality of life that they're likely to lose out on may not be particularly high. So losing out on, 2 months, right, of very low quality of life, you might think that I should have a right to prevent, right, my having to live any further.
Mm.
But the person is in their prime of their life, 30-year-old person. They might be facing a lot of adversity. They might be enmeshed in a great deal of suffering, but you might think, well, there's a good deal more risk there, because if they survive all of this, they could live many decades more, and they could potentially have a great deal of good life to look forward to. So I think that, basically what's at stake there, or what that illuminates, is that, in order to think about the justifiability of euthanasia or assisted dying, we need to think about the degree to which a person is harmed or benefited, right, by having their death hastened under different circumstances or at different points in their lives.
Hey folks, thanks so much for watching this video. And if you enjoyed it, please remember to hit the subscribe button to see all our latest content and stay up to date on new videos. Thank you.